What's up, everyone? This is a new type of video that I'm trying out for the first time, and to kick it off, I'm going to try it with GTA. So these will be the settings that I will use throughout the video. They won't change unless I'm changing a setting. For example, grass. That'll obviously change to show you the differences, but all the rest will stay the same. So yeah, these are the settings. You can pause the video, see them, copy them down, and let's get into the comparisons. So for the water at normal, you could tell that the water is very murky. Like on the shallower end, you can barely see the bottom. It's not clear, it's not realistic. But then as soon as it moves to high, you get the clear water and you get the reflections, stuff like that. Just like all the eye candy that you want to see at high settings. And also it drops the FPS by about 2 coming from normal to high. And then finally at very high, you can't really tell any changes unless you're really staring at it. Some of the splash effects, the white splash effects, they go away, become more realistic, and also the FPS just stays the same, so you could turn it on if you want. I recommend that. Okay, so moving on to shadows on normal, as you can tell, the shadows are really pixelated, they don't have much detail, and they're just really ugly to look at. And then moving on to high, they become like a lot more clear, there's more detail, they look more realistic, and also there's really no frame drops from normal to high. And finally with very high, the shadows become a lot more clear, more sharp. You can clearly tell that they become more sharp, and there's also no FPS drop, so I recommend just bumping it up to very high if you're already at high. So for extended distance scaling, as you can see at 0%, there's really no lighting in the distance at all, no shadows or anything. But at 50%, that's when shadows start to get generated, lighting, high detail textures. As you can see in the building in the bottom left with the orange roof, you can see the shadows get generated onto it. And finally at 100%, that's when shadows way in the distance get generated. There's higher detail textures, you can see cars in further areas. And also the FPS drop is really high, I think it's like 10 FPS. I recommend just turning this advanced setting off. Okay, so for extended shadow distance, at 0%, you could tell there's no distant shadows on anything in distance. It just looks kind of lifeless to me. But when you move to 50%, that's when shadows start getting added to stuff that are not too far in the distance, but you can see a distant amount of shadows. But then at 100%, that's when stuff really far away, you could see in the forest, like way down there, you could see all the shadows pop up, you can see the tree shadows, and it just looks really nice, and the FPS drop is really minimal. I think it's about 4 FPS. Okay, so moving on to depth of field, with it off, there's no blur, like when you aim in, when you hip fire, and when you aim down sights. And some people actually like this effect. Like me, I actually prefer it being off because, well, for one thing, it actually helps your FPS, and second, it actually helps you be able to see things like to the side of you. I should also mention that you actually have to turn post effects to very high or ultra, or else depth of field will be grayed out and you won't be able to turn it on. For ambient occlusion, I don't actually see a difference in visuals, but apparently there is a difference in performance, so if you don't see a difference either, then you can keep it off. Okay, so moving on to reflections, which actually have the biggest impact in terms of visuals and performance. As you can see at normal, they're very low quality, really blocky and pixelated. But then once you move on to high, they start getting a little more clear, and there's also a 4 FPS drop from normal. And then when you move to very high, the reflections become a little bit more sharp, but there's also a 2 FPS drop from high. And then finally with ultra, the reflections are really sharp. They really pop out more, you can tell they get a little bit brighter. But there's also the 6 FPS drop coming from high. And here you can also see the effects of reflections on a chrome car. So next up we have post effects, which at normal you can see there's no bloom, there's really no intense lighting effects. But once you move to high, you can actually see the bloom get added. There's a lot more God rays and stuff like that. But there's also a 2 FPS drop. And then with very high, there's a very minimal visual difference, but there's also a 10 FPS drop. I think if you want to minimize that FPS drop, you have to actually use FX-AA when you use post effects on very high. Same with ultra, there's really no visual difference, but there's no FPS drop coming from very high. So for textures at normal, as you can see, the textures are really muddy. There's like, you can't really see the textures in distance, they're not crisp at all. But once you move on to high, that's when they start getting a little bit more crisp. The road is a lot more clear and sharp, it looks a lot nicer. And also, there's no FPS drop. And finally, for very high, the textures get even more sharp. You can see it a lot better on your own monitor, but it does look a lot better. Okay, so for aliasing, it's pretty hard to actually do this on a YouTube video, but when you're actually in game, you'll be able to see the difference with the different types of aliasing. So just for this video, I'm using it to show the FPS drops for each one. For the record, I actually recommend using MSAA ×2. Okay, so next up is a very performance-hungry graphics setting in the game, which would be grass. So at normal, there's like no grass in the heavy foliage areas of the game, but you also have high FPS in those areas. So at high, that's when grass is added, but the grass doesn't have any shadows, so it looks kind of lifeless. At very high, that's when some of the grass gets shadows, but not all of it. This is also when the frames start to drop, especially in these heavy forested areas. And finally, when grass is set to ultra, as you can imagine, all the grass has shadows, so it'll drop your FPS dramatically. So as for shadows, I think these are more personal preference than anything, because whichever one you like, I would pick, because there's no frame drops between any of them except for the NVIDIA shadows, which I don't actually like. So up next is tessellation. So when it's completely off, you can't really see the tree bark sticking out. They're really flat and maybe a little bumpy. But when you turn it to normal, that's when they start sticking out a little more. They stick out even more when you turn it up to high, and as for very high, I don't really see a difference between the two. Alright, so I hope you guys liked this video. I hope it was a little helpful. This is like a new thing I'm doing. I hope to do this on more of the new games coming out. It's actually really fun to make. As for GTA, it was kind of a pain in the ass because you have to restart the game for some of the settings, and restarting it every time and getting to the same place I was at before. It's really hard to do. But clearly I did get it done in the end. I hope it turned out well, and I hope it does help you. I hope you actually like the setup of like the transitions between the quality settings and stuff like that. So leave some feedback in the comments of what you thought of the video, and I'll see you in the next one.